What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my retrospective review of Drakensang, The River of Time, a prequel to Drakensang the Dark Eye, with the original coming out in 2008, with this follow-up coming out in 2011. But Drakensang itself is based on a popular German TTRPG, also called The Dark Eye, which the original title for this game, which I've also reviewed, served as a bit of an introduction to that system for myself, and luckily this game's more refined approach to it makes that even easier to dive into. In any event, if you're curious about obscure CRPGs like this, they are kind of my bread and butter. I cover them all the time, and I was very excited to get around to this one in particular because of how highly praised it was by a lot of people. And broadly speaking, as we move to cover everything there is to know about this thing, I will say that while the story of this one is far less grand than the original, basically everything else about it has been refined and improved. But this can leave the main narrative feeling a bit lacking, which is certainly something to know, particularly when you combine it with the fact that there are much less companions to choose from in this one, even if the ones that are here are more integrated into the main story. But from there, let's first talk about the technical state of this one, as this game is slightly on the older side, and it's important to mention the main problem you're likely to run into trying to play this straight away. Both this game and the original version are unlikely to run for you if you are on Windows 10 or 11. You can get around this by simply forcing them into windowed mode on Steam by setting the launch options in the game's properties, where you just have to type -windowed into that bar and then you're pretty much good to go. That should solve it. And once that's done, you'll probably be okay. But another thing to know about the technical side of this one is the game's DLC. This game did actually receive a large expansion of sorts, known as Felizon's Secret, which I'm sure I'm probably butchering, that adds content both to the base game and a separate story to go through. But in order to play that, you're going to want to have the base game installed and fired up at least once, and then once you install the DLC, that'll actually become where you start running the game from afterwards, which is something you don't really see too often these days, but once you know about it, it probably won't hinder you in any way. Other than those two things though, I really didn't experience any bugs playing this, and while I wouldn't rule it out as a possibility just in general, the game does seem to be fine otherwise, which then brings us to the difficulties section of the video. So there are 3 difficulties that you can change and swap between at any time, and these are your standard easy, normal, hard. Now, best I can tell after playing around with all of these, what this changes is your chance to hit the enemy and your chance to be hit by the enemy. It doesn't seem to affect health totals or anything else, but as the game is not explicitly telling you what these difficulties are doing, it is possible I've missed something there, as information about this one is a bit sparse. Next up though, let's talk about character creation. So character creation is both simultaneously like the first game's character creation, as you would expect, but also refined and improved as well. Now, if you've never played Drakensang, it's important to note that the archetype or the class that you are picking determines your race and culture. So if you want to be a dwarf or an elf or anything like that, that comes with its own presets, and some are even slightly more specific, like the geode dwarf, which is only available for them. Female characters can play as an Amazonian, and a couple of others. Now, shortly into the game, you'll realize that even this has bigger consequences than you might realize, because in the beginning area of the game, you actually get 1 of 4 potential training quests based on the archetype you picked here, which I thought was pretty cool. But beyond just that general note, things I want to mention are expert mode and the cosmetic options. So unlike the original game, you actually have a little bit of customization over your character's appearance here, and while it is relatively minimal, it's better than the absolutely nothing from the first game, outside of simply male or female. Also, expert mode makes a return, which basically allows you to adjust any specific totals for your archetype in terms of your skills and talents and leveling up and whatnot. If you are not already familiar with the system, I would not advise messing with this, but what I want to call out specifically is that you can give your character bonuses and penalties this time around to individual stats, talents, etc., and doing this affects the total amount of experience you have to distribute at character creation, which I thought was a nice little touch to allow you to really customize the character you want to make, just to give it that little bit of extra depth. And the last thing I want to mention for character creation for this prequel is merely that your party composition in this particular game is a bit limited. So in my opinion, it's probably best to pick something that is not already covered by other companions, and you're pretty much guaranteed to get 2 warriors and a thief style guy. You do get a choice between 2 other companions, which can be either an archer or a battle mage respectively, and you want to keep that in mind when making your own character for the simple sake of trying to spread out what you're doing. In fact, because there are essentially no casters among your main group of allies, it can really pay off to be some sort of magic-focused archetype. But that brings me to the story setup and my thoughts on it. So right away, a few different things about the story. It's a bit meandering, and where the first game told this big grand narrative, this particular game's story is much more grounded and consists of relatively simple objectives. The problem I think it has is that it often gets distracted and sending you on little side quests in order to what honestly feels like simply give you more content before you wrap the game up. But even in spite of that, it does still have some cool moments. Though I will say up front, one thing that actually surprised me was that after you beat the main story, you can continue playing the game and wrapping up anything you missed, which I thought was a nice touch that I just wasn't expecting to see here, which was pretty cool. But in terms of story, the game starts out using a bit of a framing device. That is, one of our companions from the original title, Forgrim, is telling Gladys, one of the other companions from that game, a story about his adventuring days, reminiscing on the good times essentially, which is where this game kicks off. We find ourselves on a boat that is shortly thereafter attacked by pirates who seem to be after something, and once this attack goes down, we're eventually transported to Nadaret, which forms the, I would say, main city of the game, and is where we get properly involved with Ardo, Kano, and Forgrim, all returning characters from the original title. Ardo, however, is especially interesting because this is the character that sends your player character a letter at the beginning of the original title, only for him to actually be dead when you go to meet him. Forgrim is his bodyguard, and Kano was an acquaintance of his that ran the Thieves Guild in town. So these 3 help save you from the pirates and ask for your help investigating them, which then turns you loose on the first main hub area. Now this area is probably my favorite part of the story simply because they give you so much leeway in terms of what you want to do, because your only real goals are basically investigate around town to learn a little bit about these pirates that attacked you and to complete your training. The training itself will differ based on what your class was, and I thought that was pretty cool. But from there you go to investigate a toll house and find out what they know about the pirates, which introduces one of the cooler mechanics, I think, of the main story. So while we are dealing with relatively limited companions, with I would say really the only interesting choice being also in that first act of the game, where we choose between either Jacon or Pharis by saving one or the other, with the other one dying, as they are also investigating the pirates. But as it's a one or the other choice, they largely play the same role in terms of narrative, so it's not that crazy. But regardless of that, one cool thing that does come up with your companions in the story is that on multiple occasions, they will offer a perspective or different routes through an individual situation. So for this toll house, you can take Forgrim's idea and simply fight your way through the front gate, or you can take Kano's idea and simply go sneak in through the cellar, so to speak, which leads to its own separate encounters that play out very differently. And I think that's a pretty cool setup to have in a game like this, where it's constantly presenting you with options that are, in fact, different from one another. And even this then leads to one of 2 sides of a cool boss fight, which is another thing this game does really well. Interesting boss fights that are more mechanical in nature as opposed to a lot of the enemy spam that we saw in the first title as well. But in this section of the game, we learn that there's a whole lot of corruption going around, and that this toll house is in cahoots with the pirates, and the pirates themselves are about to raid an elven village if they can, which is our next destination. We then go to the elven village, to stop the pirates, but also to find some healing for Ardo, who was dealt some serious blow at the end of the previous section. And once he is healed here in the Elven Village, he'll finally join your party properly, as he's not actually a playable character up until that point. But the Elven Village is unfortunately mostly unrelated. You solve the pirate versus elf thing there very quickly, and you do have multiple ways through that as well, which I thought was neat. But the other part of the Elven Village is much longer and comes down to killing a demon in some haunted ruins in order to save Ardo. But what I liked about this was actually once again the boss fight. The demon at the end of those ruins can be weakened at the expense of better rewards by collecting and utilizing seals around his prison, which I thought was a nice touch. But once Ardo is healed, the elves will then tell you where they saw the pirates coming from, which leads you to a place called Hammerburg. Hammerburg and the beginning of the game, I think combined, are my favorite sections, as while there is a fair bit of combat in both, if you want there to be, much of what they are about is simply going around, talking to people, and finding solutions to quests, which can even include some things you may not have necessarily initially thought of, as the game highlights multiple quest solutions throughout. But from Hammerburg, we eventually meet the leader of the pirates, who will in fact tell us that the corruption we've already found apparent goes all the way up to the Baron of the main city, at which point we bring the fight to that person, and the Baron is being manipulated by somebody we'll have met towards the beginning of the game, known as Regis, in order to basically make the Emperor of the land look ridiculous and lose face after they stole his crown, which is something we will have learned from Ardo towards the Elven Village area. So we have to storm the Baron's castle to both put an end to the corruption with the pirates and everything, but also to win back the crown of the Emperor to apparently save the day. And it's honestly kind of an underwhelming main story otherwise, and while it does have its moments and bits I appreciated with presenting you multiple options, it's mostly just a slog through some very generic setups for various quests and leads to track down, with much of the interesting stuff happening in the side content instead. A lot of the side content is very interesting, like say killing a water dragon or fighting your way to the bottom of a water temple to fight whatever this weird crawdad looking thing is. And moments like that were fun, but unfortunately the main story, especially compared to the grand tale of the first one, is just a bit of a letdown, frankly. But then we have our progression system. So progression in this game is much like the way it is in the first game. As we complete quest objectives and take on enemies, we'll be earning experience. We can spend this experience leveling up individual portions of our character. That being things like talents, skills, your base attributes, your health, your astral energy, or your mana if you prefer, or any spells you might happen to know. Now, because of the way this is set up, warriors are much easier to play, as your weapon skills will basically be the main thing they have to worry about, followed up by pumping up their attributes, of course. But every level of your character, which is determined by your total amount of XP gained, determines the maximum that you can rank up any of these individual things. Ideally, you want to get the stuff you're actually using as close to the maximum as possible, including the occasional social or crafting stat. Now, for the most part, very generally, higher is better. The one thing to know is that for your weaponry, if you want to, you can choose to prioritize attack or parry. This is important because your attack is obviously the better hit chance on enemies, but parry is your ability to deflect the enemy's incoming attacks. And while the game, by default, chooses a very balanced approach to those things, you can skew it one way or the other if you prefer. And then we have our 8 attributes. For the most part, these are self-explanatory. Strength increases melee damage while also increasing your carry weight, constitution increases your health, etc., etc. These also have a maximum they can be at any given level, and they are very expensive in comparison experience-wise to upgrade. But the important thing to know about Drakensang is how those individual things work together. You see, basically anything you do in this game rolls 3 different attribute dice checks. Now, some things will say they only roll 2, but this is because they're rolling one of them twice. So for every skill check, etc. that you make, you are rolling 3 dice in order to make that skill check. And at a base level, what you need to do is roll lower than your attribute on a d20. And you have to succeed on all 3 of those rolls to be successful with what you're doing. But this is where your surplus points in whatever the thing is you are trying to do comes into play, because those excess points will then be used to boost your roll on any failed check. Now, because of the way this system works, in my experience, putting more than 20 points in absolutely anything, while technically possible, is generally a waste of time. Now, the exception to this is combat rolls. In combat, you're actually only rolling a single d20. But even in this system, there are some other things to know. Skills like treat wounds and treat poison and arcane lore are all very helpful, just very generally, because you will often be poisoned and or wounded, and those skills will help you with those. But you're going to need things like bandages in order to use treat wounds, or things like gold moon tea or leaves in order to treat poison. And then arcane lore will let you identify magic items. The rest of these are pretty self-explanatory, I would say, outside of maybe knowing that in order to pick locks effectively, you need to have a tool to do so, or you're going to take a massive penalty to it. But even Kano, your main thief, and likely the person who will be picking locks for you, comes with a knife that actually negates that penalty while not giving you any bonuses the way a tool would, so even that can be worked around. The rest of them tend to be more social in nature. For instance, you want plant lore in order to gather herbs effectively. You want your crafting skills if you want to craft items, which can be pretty effective, and there's a few quests that involve that. But the rest are more situational and come up in the context of various quests and the like. So all in all, it's not as complicated as it initially seems, but it's important to know what you're doing before you're spending experience around. But I will say that if you're doing everything, you should have more experience than you need. If you are actually properly building your character, you will have some wiggle room as long as you don't do things like try to max out all the different weapon skills on a character that only really needs to be using one weapon type, as an example. But while that's the basics of it, there are some things you can only learn from a trainer, which I think the tutorial section of the game, bringing you to a trainer to explain this mechanic to you and get you started with that, is a fantastic little touch into learning this system. But basically, outside of the talents and things you can raise, there are other skills and abilities that you only get from trainers. These include things like active abilities that you'll be using in combat, which can provide buffs to your attack or simply combat maneuvers, if you will, that allow you to do special attacks at the cost of endurance if it's physical, or at the cost of mana if it's a magic spell of some sort. In both of those instances, though, you need to learn your new spells or your new abilities from a trainer. This is also how you'll learn how to do things you don't know how to do, like say use a particular weapon type that your archetype is not familiar with. So if there's something your character does not know how to do inherently, you need to go find a trainer to show them how to do it, which is something I appreciate the tutorial really spelling out for people, to be honest. So right away, I would say that this game gets props for being a little easier to onboard people into this system, which brings us to the other bit of progression, which is gear. Now, unsurprisingly, gear is a big part of this RPG, including special weapons you'll find, as well as armor and jewelry, etc. that we can wear. And the main thing to know here is that some gear takes up more than one slot, and it's important to be layering and wearing your armor effectively to give you as much armor rating as possible for the various sections of your body, because this will reduce the incoming damage to your character if they actually get hit. What's more, as you might expect, gear can have all sorts of bonuses like raising your attributes or specific skills, etc. And it's probably important to mention that the game is divided up into a few different acts, and what the merchants sell, especially in the main city, is based upon this. So when you do things like clear the toll house, clear the elven village, or clear out Hammerburg, this will update their inventory and give you access to better and better stuff. But that's kind of what you're looking at in terms of progression, which brings us to the gameplay and world of this one. So generally speaking, I enjoyed this much more than the original title, but I do think it could have used with a little less backtracking overall. Now, initially, you're going to be confined to that main city, but once you've investigated the pirates and you've done your little training sequence and cleared out that story mission, you'll eventually be given access to the Thalaria, which is your ship. You quickly get appointed captain of it, at which point you're free to sail up and down the river, which is going to take you to the various points of interest that we need to get to. Each of these individual areas is a relatively large map that contains, of course, all of the content we're going to be getting up to, and because these maps are much larger individually, they come with a bit of fast travel. Basically, as you encounter certain areas on the map, they will unlock as fast travel points, and you can fast travel from those points to other fast travel points that you've unlocked, which can make getting around a little bit faster. Now, these locations include our main city hub, as I mentioned, the Elven Village, and Hammerburg. Of these, The main city and Hammerburg were my favorite, and that's because these emphasize things that are not simply combat. You can find all sorts of quests and interact with people throughout these areas to tackle individual objectives in interesting ways, and because there's all sorts of people around, you can do things like utilize the pickpocket skill, find all sorts of resources laying around to loot and then turn into crafting if you prefer. And there's all sorts of hidden and unmarked interactions here that really make the world of Drakensang feel alive and like an actual place that you are exploring, which I personally enjoyed a great deal. And if you do enough of that, you can even find and stumble upon all sorts of really interesting quests. Some, I would say, are direct references to the other game, and others are simply cool. Probably the one that made me laugh the most was the Rat Hunt quest, available relatively early, earlier than you should be doing it, as just like the first game, you very early on get access to a generic RPG quest to go kill some rats in the cellar, and in both instances, the boss of this quest is a mid to late game boss that you should not be fighting when this quest becomes available, which is meant to be a bit humorous, as in this case the boss's name is Paparazzi, but later on you get more serious hunts. Like I mentioned, there's that water dragon fight. This is reminiscent of the dragon fight from the original game as well, and while it is a water dragon, you bizarrely still need to use burn heals against its breath attack, but I was honestly already extremely overpowered by the time I fought this thing, so it was not terribly difficult. Another cool bit of optional content was the water temple. People around the river worship the river father, as they call him, and one of his priests, I guess you could say, eventually leads you to the water temple that you'll actually need to kill the water dragon to explore fully, and this leads you to a, I would say, very interesting fight against a, I guess, crawdad looking guy. And then that has a whole story attached to it, and I thought that was really fun to interact with as well. But there's really all sorts of stuff to get up to. You can, as an example, free a water nymph from an elaborate trap, find the source of poisonous water in the elven village, have the elves themselves teach you how to craft an ultimate weapon bound to your soul, get to the bottom of a mysterious mining operation done by dwarves in Hammerburg, just to name a few. But basically my point in telling you all that is simply that the side content of this game is honestly much more interesting than basically anything the main story has going on, and it's really not something you want to miss. And the one other thing I want to mention in this particular area is simply that the DLC content does sort of unbalance a lot of this. Now, throughout the game, starting at the very beginning, we'll get access to DLC specific quests. There's effectively a side quest line and a main quest line from the DLC in particular. Doing both of those and keeping up with them is going to see you vastly overpowered, at least in my experience, in comparison to the rest of the content that you're doing at that time. In fact, I found that while I probably did part of that DLC a little too early, once I managed to slog through fighting this incredible boss fight in the second part of that DLC, the rewards I got from it kind of trivialized what was left of the game. So that's probably something to know, and you may want to hold off on some of that DLC content until the very end, but more on that later. For now, let's talk about combat. So, I've pretty much already explained the basics of this, and it hasn't changed that much from the original title by any means. But very generally, if you've ever played Dragon Age Origins, you should pretty quickly get the gist of what they've got going on there. You can select individuals or your entire group. You can toggle them between defensive or aggressive, which will determine, of course, how quickly they react to enemies and how easy it is to, of course, pilot them around the battlefield, as positioning is important in a game like this, as hitting characters in the back tends to be an almost guaranteed hit, and you still have to watch out for wounds. Every time you take damage more than, I believe it's your constitution score, you have the potential to take a wound based on your willpower score, and then some special abilities apply wounds regardless. And once a character has 4 wounds, a single one more, and they will instantly die no matter what their HP total is. And you can even use that to your advantage, though I would say bosses tend to be immune to that kind of thing. Magic is also probably a little different than you've seen in other games, as while there are a whole host of spells and summons at your beck and call, let's say, a lot of them are more specific and based on the ranks you've applied to them will remain useful throughout the game, but some enemies are immune to certain damage types, for instance, so my favorite fire spell doesn't always hit every single enemy, and thus you might want to have a backup plan. It's also important to note that AoE spells, while great for clearing rooms, will also hit your characters, so it's important to open against a group of enemies with an AoE, but probably not really use it anymore afterwards. But both your magic skills as well as your combat abilities or maneuvers take up a pretty sizable chunk of your character's resource, which will recharge over the course of combat, but fairly slowly, which means you have to be careful when you're utilizing those individual abilities, or you'll find yourself not able to do anything when you need it most. But unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, the relatively limited scope of your companions means that the party composition and any variances to it outside of very generic stuff is going to be down to whatever class your character is, which is why you might want to play something that actually has access or easy access to magical abilities, because it's important to remember that armor, especially metal armor, will not let you cast spells at all. So just giving spells to your main warrior guys isn't of much use to you. But the other two things I want to mention about combat for River of Time specifically are the boss fights are incredible, and I appreciate that they chilled out a little bit on the enemy spam. So in the original game, especially towards the end of it, the amount of enemies you would have to fight in any random encounter was simply too high. It was way too much. And it could honestly get pretty annoying pretty quickly. And in River of Time here, it looks like they traded all of that enemy quantity for instead actual mechanics you have to pay attention to, which is most notable during the game's boss fights, which is why I enjoyed them so much. For instance, a relatively early on one sees you fighting this kraken-like thing in a dungeon, having to deal with its big AoE spray attack, and then every so often in phases summons in monsters you have to kill while it hides underwater. Another one sees you, rather than actually fighting anything, standing in front of podiums with archers on them in order to get a siege weapon to hit them, which I found particularly difficult to time. In fact, the DLC has my favorite examples of this, but also probably the most difficult at the end of the second and third sections. The second one seeing you fighting this giant goat man thing, but along the way to that boss you'll have picked up a bunch of crystal spheres, and at a set time during the fight you can start activating buffs with those spheres by inserting them into a pillar in the middle of the arena, kind of dictating exactly what you want to make easier about this particular fight if you're having trouble with it. And that one took me a few tries, but it was an incredible experience. And then the final boss of the DLC, you can actually either deal with a full 3-phase boss fight, or you can do a side quest as part of the DLC to get a special item that will actually cut out some of that earlier portion of it and make it much easier. But honestly, I think just the dramatics of the big 3-phase fight is probably worth going through. So in terms of all of the things that this game has improved upon from its original, I would say just the quality of the boss fights and encounters has gone up a great deal, because it relies more on tactics and system understanding and knowledge, as opposed to just how well you can deal with enormous amounts of enemies. But that finally brings us to the DLC section before we start talking about the Steam Deck and wrapping this thing up. So the DLC, as I mentioned, there's effectively a side quest line and a main quest line for the DLC. The side quest line starts immediately after you get off the boat on the first act of the game. You'll be able to buy a map from a woman selling him nearby, and this turns out to be a trap, and when you go to confront her about it, she's gone. And this turns out to be a quest involving trying to bring peace to 3 ghosts that have been killed as a direct result of her meddling, and you get some pretty cool rewards for it. Now, the rest of the DLC, the main part of it, becomes available a little ways into the game when you complete a side quest that sees some Thorwallians, as they're known, making camp on shore just a little bit outside of the main city. And in talking to them, you can learn that their leader, Felicion, is looking for something in the woods near the toll house, and you can go there and discover a planar rift, which takes you to this magical city of elves. And you can get involved and solve a conflict involving, of course, Felicion, as well as some other lore stuff in relation to the world of Drakensang. The rewards for this DLC are incredible, but I will say very broadly that the beginning of it, the first section, is very good, as you're just getting to know these people, a new culture, getting a bunch of rewards for it, and as it starts to heat up, you'll eventually be kicked out. This is your cue to find another planar rift in another part of the world, which brings you to the second section. The second section of the DLC I hated because it was an extremely long and tedious dungeon, followed by a very difficult boss fight. And while I loved that boss fight, a little warning would have been nice because it took me several tries to get that right. I died many times to this thing. But in so doing, I got some incredible rewards that made the rest of the game a little too easy. Which brings us to the final section of the DLC. This wraps this area up, sees you saving these elves, and fighting off hordes of sort of orcish enemies as we go. A lot of fantastic fights, a lot of great rewards, and it has that sort of grand narrative feeling that the main story is definitely lacking. So in many ways, I would say the conclusion of this DLC felt like more of an end to the narrative adventure than the rest of the game did. But that brings us to the Steam Deck before we wrap this up. Simply put, I could not get this to work on the Steam Deck. I cannot find a rating for it on the store page, and honestly, this game has so little information, it's hard to even collate exactly what the issue is, but if I had to guess, some of the reasons that keep it from running on modern machines are likely at play here. And while I would never say it's impossible, you might be able to get this running on the Steam Deck. Even if you did, it definitely does not have controller support, so you'd have to customize the keys, and because of the age of this game and the fact that I want to say the developer is out of business these days, I don't believe it supports Steam cloud saves either, so probably not impossible, but it didn't work for me, I can say that to be sure. Which brings us to the positives and negatives before we reach our conclusion. So on the positive side of things, I thought all of the refinements from the original game were great and very welcome. They make the game feel a little more natural to play and explore in. In particular, I thought the boss fights and the way they shifted away from numbers into actual game mechanics for their bosses was a ton of fun. I think they did a lot of great work there, and that's to say nothing of exploring the world in areas like the main city or Hammerburg that see you finding unique quest solutions, or the different paths through the main story, or the different training sessions at the beginning of the game based on your class. All are moments that really make it feel like you're playing a good classic RPG, which is, I would say, the most fun I was having playing this individual title. But in spite of those fun things, we do certainly have some negatives. The big one for me was definitely the limited party size. It very much so limits your party composition, and on one hand, it kind of prevents you from failing too hard, simply because they could design encounters around at least a minimum of a certain type of party composition. It's still a little unfortunate that you're fairly limited in what you can experiment with as a result. Another downside, in my opinion, was the limited amount of locations you'll be going to, as there are really not that many, but also how much you'll be running back and forth between them. So we get our ship, of course, to travel down the river, and we're often going to be going back and forth to places multiple times when there really just doesn't seem to be much of a need to. One of the optional side areas, for example, called the Hunting Preserve, will only let you handle fighting and collecting trophies from individual animals and things on the preserve every so often, which means you have to leave, progress the story a little bit, come back, fight another generic animal, to do the next part of the quest, leave and come back, etc., etc. So stuff like that can be applied to the rest of the game because it's everywhere, and constantly running back and forth between these areas for stuff that just really does not feel important at all can wear on your patience pretty quickly, which is why I would put that down as a negative, because I think if there was any other part of this game that could have been streamlined, it was definitely that. Especially when you consider that the placement of some of their fast travel points is less than ideal and still sees you running in between certain areas repeatedly, when if they had just put a fast travel point a little closer to where you actually have to go constantly, it would have saved you a lot of time. But all of that brings me to my conclusion. I would say Drakensang River of Time is mostly a much refined version of the original game, which I have to imagine is why this one is so highly praised, despite its relatively lackluster main story, which is honestly another negative. But between the great side content, a lot of really interesting side quests to be specific, a lot of fantastic boss fights at the end of some of those quests, makes for a pretty memorable RPG. In fact, some of these bosses I'll probably be thinking about in the form of some sort of list video in the future, I'm sure, because I enjoyed them that much. And where the original Drakensang was a sort of introduction to this system for me, the River of Time is really where I felt comfortable using it, and I could play around with more concepts and ideas to go right along with having to fight, of course, these more interesting bosses. But to sum it up a little more succinctly, if you are looking for another CRPG with deeper mechanics to get into in a system you are not necessarily familiar with, I think the River of Time is a fantastic option for that. If, of course, you're willing to put up with a main story that is probably the least interesting part of the game. With that in mind, full price, this one is still a little expensive. The base game is $20 and the DLC is $10, but you can find it on sale pretty regularly. I picked up the base game and the DLC myself on a sale last year. I think it was for like $6, which is a much more palatable price. But all in all, I had a mostly great time with this one, so much so that I'm actually a little surprised this isn't more well known, especially because having played these two, I would really enjoy a more modern RPG utilizing these rule sets as well, and any updates or changes it's had since then, simply because it provides a really fun alternative to things I am more familiar with. And so, if any of that sounds interesting to you at all, maybe consider giving this one a go. But for right now, that's pretty much going to do it for me. I certainly hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. Let me know how you feel about this one or its DLC down in the comments section below. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.